come closer to each other. The risk for pathogens to move from one species to another increases, in this case from a bat to humans. And it illustrates that in this very interconnected world, there are indeed a number of risks. Pandemics is one, climate change is another, because it's a global pollution issue. Biodiversity loss and ecosystem decline is a third, where we also run the risk of being very, very badly hit, all of us, when vital ecosystems do not provide the services we are used to any longer. But you can add a few other sort of human-made potential catastrophes. One is the whole financial sector and system, the build-up of debts. Whenever I meet an expert in the financial sector, they tell me that it's just a question of time when the next major crisis will hit us. And you could add, and I guess Ria will comment on that later on, you could add some of the new now emerging exponential technologies which offer a lot of opportunities, but also a lot of risks. One in particular that is, I think, worrying me at least, is the possibility to manipulate elections and thereby undermine democracy. We are seeing it already. Another one is the emergence of a, what I would call a surveillance state, where you use technology to control people in a way we not even Orwell in 1984 thought was possible. So there are a number of these kind of risks on this small planet. And of course, we have to be mindful of them, and we have to be mindful of the fact that through the way the economy is organized, these risks are growing as we speak. So we need to rethink development, and we need to try to build resilience against them rather than the opposite.
Thank you very much, Anders.
I'll go to the next question. Yes, thanks.
That'd be fantastic. Thank you.
So, Anders, I have a question for you. And since you provided us a forward-looking vision, I want to go back a little bit in time. And knowing the growth trajectory of the planet since the time of the publication of the research, which the Club of Rome was very important for, and that you're honorary president of, the publication is The Limits of Growth. What few key policy actions do you feel are applicable now to manage the current health and climate crises? Any thoughts that you can share with myself as well as the audience today? Thank you.
Well, a tall order. Let me just say that I think the main problem we have is that the way we measure progress in society is very outdated, because we only look at quantitative production growth, as if any type of production would be positive. Some is positive, some is very negative. When we were a small population on a big planet, almost anything was possible. But now in a world with soon to be 8 billion people, we don't have the luxury to use resources the way we do, and to generate as much pollution and degrade the environment as we do. So I think we should start focusing on other measurements or indicators, because what we measure is very, very important. And I would like to move from production growth in the terms of GDP to well-being for people. And there we have a number of indicators which relate to health, which relate to ecosystem health, which relate to climate stability, which relate to employment, etc. So that's one obvious one. A second one is, of course, to realize that we have built an economy that is extremely short-term in nature. Financial sector that I commented upon a couple of minutes ago is extremely short-term. Whatever happens after 5 to 10 years is of limited interest. And that means that all these sustainability goals that we are pursuing have a tough time in an economy which tries to maximize profit in the short term all the time. So the tension between the short term and the long term, and this discounting of the future is, I think, very, very problematic. And finally, I think that when it comes to the exponential technologies, we really need to try to understand how they are being, how they emerge, and how we can put a framework so that they help us moving in the right direction.
Thank you, Anders. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This is a brilliant question. And I think to summarize there, I think one of the points, a really important one, is to focus more on the well-being of people for the ecosystem health and for climate stability, and knowing that we work on a very short-term political model and democratic system. One is minded to even think maybe we need commitments like the SDGs, which are looking at more long-term goals that governments and state level can commit to.
I would like to add two things. We have to stop subsidizing the wrong things. And we have to stop taxing the wrong things. We are taxing work, but we don't tax resource use, which is, in my opinion, totally wrong. So there are so many things in the economy that has to be rethought.
Precisely. Thank you very much. And it brings actually quite nicely to a question which I've got for you, Ria, which is considering the growth trajectory of the planet since, for several years, temperatures have been rising, and they've been rising globally, and weather patterns have been less predictable. We've gone through this statistical climate change where it's not necessarily as immediate as the healthcare emergency that we actually face now with COVID-19. And really, I ask you as a technologist, but also a disaster risk reduction expert, can you explain what preparedness is to the audience, and also why technology is so crucial when developing a response system to disasters?
Thanks a lot, Theo, for this excellent question. And let me first begin by explaining very simply, preparedness in one word is readiness, and it ideally builds up to a state of future resilience of both people and planet simultaneously. And that's, I think, the ultimate goal of a green growth trajectory, and also as we seek to build back better from the COVID-19 crisis. So let me zoom into the current scenario, and we have a health crisis ongoing, which is also a type of a disaster. This is a novel zoonotic disease, which is classed as a biohazard. And preparedness is actually something that we are living with, and it's very actively ongoing, but it might be less obvious. So preparedness efforts range from individual level activities, such as, for instance, first aid provisions, to household actions like stockpiling supplies, organizational readiness, such as BCPs, business continuity planning, as well as government initiatives like contingency plans, as well as public advisory dissemination. So what I'm trying to explain by giving this sort of a sweeping snapshot is that preparedness is the prerogative of all, and not only the public or the multilateral actors. Technology in this bigger scape is an imperative piece for both preparedness and response actions. And this is where I tackle your question specifically. How so? I think the testimony is that we are connected digitally right now through communications backbones and networks, enabling work, study, business, operations, commerce, recreation, and even socializing at a safe distance. So the direct applications and the benefits that we're reaping of this, as Anders called it, exponential growth in emerging technologies is in diagnostics, where smart artificial intelligence is helping to diagnose in a more effective manner COVID-related anomalies with greater accuracy, treatment. AI is also rapidly using indexed drug libraries to undertake scores of permutation and combination to come up with a novel cure. And this is ongoing as we speak. Tracking and tracing, which is a little bit controversial, and this also speaks to the concerns that Anders mentioned about our digitally interconnected world and some of those privacy and surveillance related issues. But on the other hand, the tracking and tracing has also been successful for certain countries to curb the rapid contagion of COVID. And let me close off by saying that whilst I am an eternal optimist in the use of technology, because I've seen the benefits that it could bring when used with optimal regulation, I believe the strong connection between people, process, and technology needs to be underlined and also preserved for an effective response to this crisis, as well as any other crisis that might be induced by another event, including natural hazard. And finally, I think dropping a technology on the problem isn't the sole solution. Technology designed for a purpose is most effective. And resilient technologies, therefore, should be the goal of public, private, as well as community level actors as we seek to build back better, because those resilient systems and technologies will actually outlast any type of crisis, be it health, be it environment, be it technological, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ria. And it's really interesting to hear from a telecommunications expert to raise those security risks that brought toward as well what Anders had referred to. But we are in a digitally interconnected world, and we are faced with these predicaments. We know that tracking and tracing has been effective in certain countries, and maybe it's learning from those lessons and knowing that is the World Health Organization guidance. It brings me to a question actually to ask Martha, in terms of considering these differing responses within countries and by states. I mean, taking Kerala, for example, in India, who have adopted the WHO recommendations from January on, the test, trace, isolate, and support systems, to states in America where you've seen mixed responses and also mixed, I suppose, crises occurring. Some are much more worse than others. I mean, Martha, can I ask you, how well do you think the state or public sector's bodies have been able to respond to the crisis, and how do we see this playing out as different countries aim to build back better?
Hi everyone. Well, thank you everyone for your time tuning in. It's so interesting to hear the discussion so far. I've been taking a lot of notes. So I mean, this question of the public realm, a lot of the work that we do at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, where I work at UCL in London, is about how do you rethink the role of the public sector. And I'm going to kick this topic off on public response with two different but connected points that I think are very important. The first is about health, and the second one is about economics, about markets, and speaks to some of Anders' work. And then later on in this conversation, I think it will be really important to open this out into talking more about equity and about fairness of the two kind of joint crises we're currently facing. And the first point I want to make, and it's a really important one, is that the climate emergency, just like COVID-19, is a public health crisis, and it really needs to be seen in this wider context. As global heating increases, the Earth gets hotter, environments become degraded, we will see increases in respiratory diseases caused by air pollution. We'll see these new diseases developing in hot places or in close animal-human proximity. We'll see drinking water becoming more difficult to source, and just studies over the last month have been pretty depressing, coming out charting that by 2070, we'll have 3.5 billion people living in unbearable heat. And the human body is ultimately not designed to live with that much heat. This is it's really important to remember what we're seeing in the sense of people's lifestyles and people's health and well-being, and all the pressures that puts on our current system. So when you're questioning yourself or others as to how will governments, how will people deal with climate change when it comes down the line, well, we're already seeing the response to one present-day public health emergency, and the climate health elements might be slower to develop. Climate change is more cumulative, whereas COVID-19 is more contagion in terms of a taxonomy of how you look at crises, but they'll ultimately create from the climate crisis a web of multiple public health issues. And the threat to slow down the economy in this is very similar to what we're experiencing right now. So to move kind of more onto this economic point, and I'll try not to use too much jargon around here, but I think it is interesting to talk about some of the theory that sits behind how you talk about the economy and markets and how they're embedded within each other. And go back to this question of where the public realm sits within that, where the public sector, but also where citizens sit within that. What we do in the Institute is to try and rethink and research the role of the state in innovation in particular. And so much innovation is being needed right now, both in kind of traditional science research, what we'd see as technological innovation, these really interesting things that are coming out from the work that Ria does, but also in organizational and community-based innovation that happens much more widely than the kind of traditional places you might think. And how can the state triangulate with innovators in all these different spaces to get to outcomes that make our lives better and solve these grand societal challenges and point the economy in that direction in order to do so? And the crisis has really been the first time in years that actually everyone's first response has been to ask, what is the government going to do about this? And this happened in 2008, of course, in the financial sphere, but before that, for a long time in the financial and non-financial sphere, the actions of the state have not really been the first port of call when you come to thinking about innovation. And in many countries, not least in the UK, where Theo and I live, but also in the US, the crisis has shown up some of these shortcomings in the innovative capability of the state to respond. And I would argue that more than that, it's actually shown up how the way that we as economists think about the role of the state itself over the last half century has been very kind of inappropriate and not kind of useful. Since the 1980s, governments have really been told to take a back seat on areas like innovation, to let business steer and create wealth, and to intervene only for the purpose, and this is where it gets very market-based, of fixing market problems when they solve. So when they arise, so the idea of fixing market failures, the government is there to provide basic services. It provides education, healthcare, it sorts out potholes, depending on what country you live in, and then it gets out of the way to let the private sector assume this role of key innovation engine. And then the government comes back into play when things go wrong. So you have market failures that lead to negative externalities, or positive ones, but negative ones like pollution, which then needs to be priced out of the market with taxes, with subsidies being put in this way that Anders has talked through. But the fact that pollution still occurs, despite this ex post solving for market failures, indicates something wrong with this whole approach in terms of the outcomes that actually happen for the public good. And on the flip side, some positive sectors like housework or social care, or things like neighbourhood interaction, which we didn't really realise how much we valued it until we're suddenly in this lockdown, feature in a very limited way when it comes to being measured or thought about by this market failure, market fixing approach. And then when it comes to economic growth metrics like GDP, they don't feature at all. And this is completely, it leads us to really question, when you dig down deep into it, what is the value that we're putting on different sectors in our society, and where has that come from? And I think something this leads to is a question about what are we, how are we thinking about the role of future generations, about our kids, their kids, and their kids' kids, when we go about making policy in this market fixing manner. It becomes like the future generations are almost like an invisible and a voiceless actor in our lives, but without taking them into policy decision making, we're not going to leave them a very prosperous world. And some countries are doing some really interesting, good stuff on this. So in Wales, they have a specific post in government, which is the Commissioner for Future Generations. And that person reviews all law as it comes in and develops against the needs envisioned for future generations. And so far they've stopped the expansion of a motorway. And it's really like some really concrete stuff can be drawn out when you start developing innovation within government to deal with long-term crises or with long-term societal challenges. Places like Bhutan as well have moved away from GDP to gross national happiness, and this was done quite a while ago, whereas New Zealand has only more recently created a budget that's based on well-being rather than GDP. So to kind of come back to your question, I think the limited and the narrow role that I've outlined that we've seen for governments for a long time means that governments are not always prepared when it comes to deal with crises like COVID or like climate, or myriad of other upcoming challenges like digital revolution, or even things like healthy aging and demographic shift. The default to being the market failure machine means that governments are making insufficient preparations, this concept of preparedness. They're not investing necessarily against large systemic shocks that are coming down the line. And in the process, critical institutions that provide public services in the public good are weakened. So the NHS in the UK is a good example. There's been $1 billion worth of cuts to public health since 2015, and this is all in this big kind of potion of austerity measures that were imposed after 2008 in the first place, and devolve as well down to local government as well as the capabilities of national government. So this sounds a bit bleak, but it kind of gives the backdrop to why it's understandable that not all states were able to leap into action immediately to go against COVID. And then planning the recovery afterwards, it hasn't been a snap into action, and not everyone is thinking about building back better. It's an argument, an economic argument, that we need to actually make really strongly, rather than default back to the economy that we've kind of been living in. And this crisis should give us a bit of a pause actually to do that, and in that sense also to rethink not just how the state works, but how the state works with the private sector, the kind of conditions that are set on the private sector as it comes back into force after COVID. And this is a really big question about how exploring how in this new post-COVID moment we choose to deal with capitalism and do capitalism differently, and think about what that means for a new sense of resilience. And I think I could talk about this for a long time, but I think the idea of moving states from this role of market failure towards a more co-creative market shaping approach with the private sector, with kind of conditions and contracts and interesting ways of working together, is something that we work on kind of quite a lot in practical terms at the Institute and in research terms as well. And trying to think, you know, how do we broaden that out within this post-COVID moment to create a more kind of mutually beneficial society that has this public value at its heart.
Thank you very much, Martha. I think that was a really thorough answer as well. And one common theme that seems to be coming up and speaking to this point, where preparedness is actually something that is now, and it's something where we need to consider that that is our priority in the present. And that's something that governments do need to consider when they are looking about the values that we are considering for future generations. I also thought there was something interesting about considering the social function of science in this predicament. But leaning into your last point, I wanted to come to Anders and ask him, Anders, can I ask you about your work working with public and private partnerships? I know it's particularly relevant to climate-kic. It's quite interesting to learn from you regarding low carbon solutions that you see and how business models can be rethought for social benefit moving forwards, and even considering the circular economy itself. Anders.
Yeah, thank you. Let me first say that when I listen to Martha, it's very much like listening to Mariana Mazzucato, who really has shown us through her books the importance of the private sector, the public sector when it comes to innovation. I'm working now with the climate-kic, which is an innovation program. And we have taken on a new strategy which is much more systemic in nature, realizing that single point solutions rarely bring about the impact we need when it comes to transforming society in the wake of climate change. So you need to look at many aspects in a city or a region. You don't just look at one technology or one particular vertical solution. You have to look at governance, you have to look at policy, you have to look at people, you have to look at social issues, you have to look at technology, of course, and it's all coming together if you do it the right way. So the role of the public sector here in creating an environment where you ask the research and the innovation community to come up with solutions to a specific question, I think is very, very important. Now, going back to your question about the circular economy, you know, it's been interesting. I've been dealing with climate change for quite a number of years. And until very recently, we were only focusing on energy and energy systems. Quite understandable, because our energy system is still 80% based on fossil fuels. So of course we have to change that system, but we have tended to overlook the role of materials. I'm one of the members of something called the International Resource Panel, and we've done a number of studies into materials over the long term. We have come to the conclusion that the extraction and production of all kinds of materials contribute to more than 50% of carbon emissions and 80% of biodiversity loss. So that really shows that it's not only energy, it's also materials. Steel, cement, plastics, aluminium, of course fossil fuels, biomass, etc. All the way how we manage or how these materials flow through society. And today, basically linear production flows. You know, we take materials, we turn them into products, and then we throw them away after maybe a month or a few years. There's very little thought given at the beginning how to design something so that it can be reused, refurbished, so that it can have a long product life, etc. So the discussion about the circular economy is a very broad one, and there is no crystal clear definition of what the circular economy is. It's more like a metaphor of using materials more wisely. And by doing that, we save money, because we threw away a lot of money now. Secondly, we avoid becoming scarce in terms of vital materials in the future. There is a lot of resource depletion going on. And we limit pollution. By and large, steel, cement, plastics, and aluminium make up more than 20% of carbon emissions. And we see that all over the world, there is more urban infrastructure being erected because of population growth, because of urbanization. So if we continue to do materials as we've always done, we are toast. The Paris Agreement has no chance because only the emissions related to infrastructure development and the use of materials will eat up the carbon budget we have. So we have to do it in another way. And I think we are starting to realize how that could be done. And I think 3 policy issues are very important. One is it's too cheap to use nature. Tax the use of nature. Because today, the use of virgin materials most often is less expensive than using secondary materials. So what we recycle is not really being well used. Secondly, we need design criteria. And my dream is, in the European Union context, that we would have sort of a formula saying that any product or service put on the European market has to be in the form normally that it can be easily dismantled and materials and components can be reused and recycled. And the third one is, of course, for the public sector to be a driver in this direction, because the public sector is around 20% of the economy. So if it starts to look for these kind of solutions, it will mean a lot. Finally, the optimal solution is to turn products into services. I don't have to own my mobile phone. I could lease it instead. And I can tell you, if I would lease it, it would be in the interest of the producer to produce something that lasts long so that they can earn revenue for a long period of time. And at the end of the service, they are also interested in making sure that some of the components and materials that are still of value could be reused. Now, as when they've sold the product, they don't simply care. We have to change that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Anders. I couldn't help but thinking, when you were referring to the resourcefulness, the need for resourcefulness, that does happen in the developing world as a need and a necessity given the context. But really going to that last point you made, which I found it actually quite profound, I think it's putting value into the product through actually asking the provider to own that product and providing it like a bank account maybe, and servicing it to someone else as a rent rather than us owning. And as you were saying that, I think really important to make that point. It's then in their interest to develop products which last longer. But really going back and thinking about development and capacity building, Ria, can I ask you a question? I want to try and keep it succinct because we're low on time and we really want to get to the audience and answer some of their questions. But this pandemic has led to a rush of scientific investment, and there's huge impacts that are causing insecurity across sectors. But there is also a difficulty here, and it's come up a few times in our conversation, is how do we actually separate scientific, social, and economic dimensions as we respond to the pandemic? Because it is a very holistic issue. Could you elaborate on that, Ria?
Thanks, Theo. So I can now put my risk analyst hat on. And I think that as long as we are human beings, we live in a complex, interconnected world. Economies, societies, and communities are very intricately linked together. And this gives rise to a multi-risk context. And we can visualize this multiple coexisting risks as like a multi-layered sort of a cake. And because of the interconnection across the borders, the threats of multiple cascading transboundary risks are a stark reality. And this sort of complexity in the riskscape, if I can call it that, has existed for time immemorial. We can just look to history, for instance, the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, the 2008 global financial crisis, that originated in advanced economies, but the shocks impacted emerging markets, as well as the 2004 Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami, which touched countries across Asia and the Pacific. So this means that this domino effect is actually something that we have dealt with in the past, but at this time, one of the biggest understandings and let's say sea change in policy and planning is abandoning a unidimensional way to view risk and using a systemic risk lens to analyze multiple coexisting complex risks. And that then leads me to think of recovery and reconstruction post-COVID, which should prepare countries and peoples for multiple simultaneously occurring risks, in which case agile, adaptable preparedness and response plans are quite critical. And in this respect, multilateral entities and myself working with the United Nations can say that this has been a gap in a considerable sense, and now doubly hard efforts are being dedicated to provide guidance, advisory, and support to national governments to adopt this more systemic approach to analyze and respond to risks. This is quite a long-term project, but this is why the short-sighted approach of only treating the health crisis in isolation of the ongoing climate crisis will do little good. COVID has been a testing ground for systems readiness in case of global crises taking place all at once. And as we can see, a lot more is wanting. I do want to end on a positive, forward-looking note. And I follow a lot the works of Nassim Taleb, who's a very famous economist. And he talks of black swan events, which are basically events which turn the tide in the way that things work. And I want to consider that this COVID crisis is a green swan event, which will help us to revisit the old ways of dispensing business and come up with more greener and sustainable solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ria. I think it's very interesting. I like the analogy with the black swan. It's actually come up before, and I always wonder whether is the black swan the right analogy? Is the black swan the right analogy? Because this isn't a random event. This is something which has happened before in human history. And I find it very interesting to explore that. But I do want to engage the audience. You've come forward with some fantastic questions, so thank you very much. And it's Martha, I want to come to you first. Maybe you've got something you want to pick up in regards to what Ria has said, but also there's another question here for you, if I may address you with it. What lessons are you observing from COVID-19? How is the world responding that you think could be applied for addressing climate change? And I believe that question's coming from Mexico. It would be fantastic to hear from you, Martha.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. One of my instinctual kind of reactions is that it's very early in the game to tell, but that we can see governments and organizations doing some really interesting things, and I'll run through a few of them. But firstly, also just to be clear to Anders, I'm glad that I sound like Professor Mazzucato, because the Institute is run and founded by Professor Mariana Mazzucato, so I'm glad that the message is kind of getting through. She founded it a couple of years ago. So I think I want to also pick up a little bit on this kind of question of risk and unfairness, and how this feeds into the different innovations that are being taken across the world for COVID, and how they kind of touch on different types of people and what we can learn from that. And very aware that, you know, I'll try and do this within a minute. We'll see. So I mean, this question of risk is huge. It's one of the many kind of more negative narratives of climate change, and I also don't want to kind of just pull up the negatives, but that in failing to take steps to mitigate it as a world, we're taking a huge risk, a big gamble. But this is not an equal risk for everyone. Both climate and COVID are very deeply unfair and unjust crises that treat demographic groups of people differently. Global North and Global South, people with different types of jobs, people with different racial and gender implications. And if we really want a green transition, and we're going to kind of bother to put all this effort into it, trying to do that in a way that is as equitable and as fair as possible is kind of the only route that I see forward. It can't just save the world in order to replicate the very unfair economic system that we currently have. And the move away from kind of current industrial systems, ones that are based on fossil fuels, will leave a lot of people without jobs. And there's a lot of innovation to be done in the training and upskilling and well, not upskilling, but just changing entirely. You're asking people to entirely change their lifestyles and learn completely new things, rather than, you know, leaving behind towns full of old car factories and no jobs. And I think that the kind of COVID moment that we're in is unveiling before very many people's eyes just how many inequalities lie within the current system. So what we need to plan now for is not just a just transition, a fair transition that people have been talking about in the climate space for a while, but a just and a fair recovery. And I think that we've kind of seen how one of the amazing things that's kind of come out from innovation in the public sphere through the COVID crisis is a real understanding of where innovation comes from, that it's not just within business or just within government, but actually we're seeing mutual aid groups developing from springing out of nowhere that are taking on food delivery for others. You know, in the same sense as Kate Rayworth talks about technological economies of sharing freely online. You see free DIY mask sewing patterns and PPE patterns flooding the internet, and free ventilator patterns and all these kinds of things. Those are huge innovations that are happening in lots of different countries at once and very, very bottom up. So I think that we're seeing a lot of, you know, there's interesting things and big recovery packages coming top down, but it's also really vital that we explore what's happening bottom up, local level, with citizens, with people like the people who are listening right now with Cov360. People are really, really getting engaged and getting involved, and I think it's important that we kind of note those things as well as looking at the public sphere or the kind of organizational responses to COVID.
Really great answer. Thank you very much, Martha. And particularly enjoyed you mentioning Cov360, because I do think it is a very innovative volunteer-led organization, and it does illustrate how innovation can come through that means. And I'm also fascinated when you're saying that this open source network that we're creating, where knowledge is being shared widely and across the globe, is a fantastic innovation. And something that we do need to harness as well, because of course it has its threats, as we've gone over the data security before in this call. Anders, there's a question that I want to bring to you, and it's relevant to today because of that stimulus package that's come out and speaks to your experience. It came from Jean. He's asked the question, to what extent do you think the EU can influence policy making of developing countries? Why, if I may add as well, why I find this particularly interesting is because you, of course, have tariff systems as well. And when we're thinking about our production and our consumer demands and how those ecosystems work, I wonder whether that's something also that can be influenced through policy making.
Well, sorry, what do you mean by tariff system?
I mean, in the sense of through the trade system, we have the availability of getting resources made affordably in other lower rates.
Okay. Yeah. We welcome imports of raw materials, but not necessarily value-added products. No. I agree that that's of course a problem. Well, I think there are a few leaders in Europe, including Mrs. Merkel, who I think for quite a number of years have been very conscious of the fact that we as a union need to do much more in terms of assisting economies in the South to develop on the right track. We have a terrible legacy with colonialism, etc., and some of the trade system is still not fair. It's quite unfair. But I think that the union now, when launching the Green Deal, has of course to make sure that every aspect of the Green Deal is being transformed into the development cooperation portfolio. And I'll give you a few examples. Access to modern energy carriers is absolutely essential for any kind of development to take place. You cannot get out of poverty if you have to rely on animal dung and fuel wood. You need access to modern energy. And so far in Africa, we have, ironically, although it's the continent which should be able to utilize solar energy much more than any other, we have very limited investment so far. Simply because A, there is very little capacity for energy and energy policy making. There has been too little funding available, and private sector investments have not been forthcoming because many private investors look upon the investment environment as very insecure. Here, of course, the European Union could do a lot to stimulate these kind of investments. We need to multiply investments every year in solar technology, in particular in Africa. A lot of investment is taking place in China, in India and Brazil, but apart from that, the rest of developing countries, they get very little of this. And the risk is very, very great that they get stuck in the carbon economy because they need some kind of modern energy carriers. And if it's not solar or wind or biomass, efficient biomass, it's going to be coal, oil, and gas. And we can also be sure that the fossil fuel industries are very efficient in marketing in these countries. And you also have a country like Russia, you have a country like the US, you have a country like Japan, who is pushing fossil-based technologies still in this day. So here I think so much has to happen, and it has to happen very, very quickly. And I've just picked energy as an example, but there are many others. You know, regenerative agriculture, how to stop soil erosion and start building carbon in the soil is another example, where we are now, I think, going to incentivize farmers in Europe to do the right thing. Well, we should, of course, do the same in developing countries. So I think these two agendas, our own Green Deal and whatever we try to export in terms of ideas, concepts, and also support in terms of investments in developing countries, has to be like this. Otherwise, we are not true to what we try to do.
Thank you very much, Anders. I think brilliant answer, and you've spoken about the advancement of technology being of benefit as well here, but of course there is of course the critical challenge: how do you make energy affordable? And that is possibly something where developed countries are better positioned to advance that technology. I want to deviate slightly from this area and speak to something which I think is a very interesting question. We recently had a trend report on our website about indigenous communities in central Amazon. So why I find this interesting, and I want to ask you this question, Ria, is we've spoken a lot about how advanced countries build resilience against climate change issues like increasing temperatures. The question is, will people, for example, those living in poverty and indigenous groups, be left out by such preparedness plans that they don't take into account their realities? Is interesting for a localization point, maybe from a humanitarian perspective as well. Ria, over to you, please.
Thank you, Theo. That's a very pertinent question. And I think that's something which is painfully at the forefront of a lot of the global discussions, because oftentimes those high-level meetings in Geneva or in New York are not really having adequate representation of indigenous communities or groups that are less privileged than others. But on the other hand, I feel that in the recent past at least, and this is the way that a lot of the discourse has been shaping, there has been a very active consultation as well as engagement with community level representatives. And that process has also fed up to the higher multilateral agreements as best as possible. This doesn't mean that every single interest has been equitably or equally voiced and represented, but it does mean that opportunities have been provided in a consultative space. I think a lot more is wanting and a lot more needs to be done to provide, for instance, safety mechanisms, to provide redressal, as well as to provide opportunities for more regular interface between community representatives and those sitting at the much higher levels. And that's something which I hope that in the next phase, in this post-COVID recovery situation, we would be able to consider those voices much more strongly. On the other hand, there has been some heartening news, because a lawsuit that was filed between some representatives living in the Amazon and a particular oil and gas production company culminated with the indigenous community winning against this large oil and gas company. So these sort of historical precedents become examples for those who might be, let us say, impinging upon the rights of indigenous groups. But of course, this is one of the biggest challenges in development, and that's why a lot of, for instance, colleagues and myself are working in this space, because we want to be able to provide that opportunity to engage communities, to be able to represent, let us say, on issues which they hold dear. And I think that's something which I think development needs to continue to hold in the way that we do our work, the way that we do our business, is not ultimately to benefit the top, but to benefit those which have the least. And that's why we have the motto of leave no one behind. And that's why that motivates the SDGs as well. Thank you.
Brilliant answer. Thank you very much. And I think so critical to start considering how local communities can be feeding into our response. And it all happens at a very high level, and it's not always that relatable or culturally sensitive to the context it's being retrofitted on, if I could use that phrase. I want to again come back to the EU, and Martha, ask you a question, and maybe it reflects your background when you were working with energy instruments within Europe. Let's say now, unfortunately, the UK's changed its position. Probably shouldn't say unfortunately, but now attention and most importantly funds are being deviated to COVID. For example, within the European Union, what is the best way to combine the two challenges to avoid losing momentum? And what do you think the impact on the climate energy policies will be? Very present question. Martha.
Yeah, I think that we've seen just yesterday the Next Generation EU package came out, which kind of gave a lot of service to the green tech, to the green industry and to digital economy in the same kind of breath. And also, again, focus back on the just transition mechanism that originally came out of the EU Green Deal in late 2019. So I think there's some really good kind of shoots of bringing all these things together, although it does depend a little bit on how this is then kind of deployed more widely and where that money actually ends up being channeled to. I think it's, it's really interesting to think about the kind of statistics that we're seeing around the actual impact of COVID-19 right now on economic activity and what that's meant for short-term greenhouse gas emissions. And there was a paper last week released in Nature finding that we've had, just in April 2020, there was a global 17% decrease in greenhouse gas emissions compared to the previous year, and the drop this year predicted is between 4 and 7%. And that sounds to our ears, where we've done, we've heard that it needs to go down. Sounds huge, but it's just not. 7% year on year to 2050 is the decrease that we need to reach 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement. And there's a huge amount to do as we come out of lockdown. And I think a lot of that work can take place within the energy sector itself. I've been listening to the International Energy Agency sharing some really interesting thoughts about the work that can be done in the retrofit, in the insulation sense. If you take into account that 70% of buildings within just the European Union were built before 1990s housing regulations standards came in, there's a huge amount of work to be done to retrofit those buildings to standard, and to standard for a warming climate, not just a standard for the historically cooler EU climate. And a lot of the places where that work needs to be done is in places where there are poorer housing in the first place and poorer quality of life and a lot of unemployment going on. So these things can all match up to meet this just transition, just recovery I've been talking about. But it has to be really planned like that. It has to be strategic and take on the systems level approach that climate-kic works so hard on. And I think that insulation is one area, energy efficiency, rethinking how we do energy efficiency in a new era is another one. And thinking also about this, what is the new value that we want to assign to nature, having seen now how valuable it is to us. There's a lot of work going on in rewilding. I think it's 3 billion trees they want to build as part of this new package. There is a lot of both climate and workers' rights, jobs development, both going on collaboratively in that space. So I'm quite positive, quite kind of optimistic about that.
Thank you, Martha. Good to have a little bit of optimism in this particular predicament we find ourselves in. And thank you for a very thorough answer again, and very helpful. I do, if it's the same article, I do remember reading something in Nature to that effect as well. And it is quite disturbing to just see that it is a short-term drop. It's not terrific change. I think it drew it back to 2006, the levels had gone down to, but just temporarily. I think that's an important point to highlight. And there's a very good question, I believe, coming in from Sudhir Verma. And he's asked a question, Anders, if I can ask you this, relevant now, of course. What do you think of the future of the Paris Agreement?
Well, let me first build on the response by Martha and say that, I think that many people don't realize one thing, and that is that even if emissions go down a bit, we still increase the concentration in the atmosphere. So that's continuing to go up because we are in a bathtub. And as long as you don't reduce significantly the total volume, but you add a little bit less than the last year, the bathtub continues, the water continues to increase. So it's very important to make people understand that we cannot solve this problem by social distancing and closing down factories, because then the whole system will collapse. So this is just a temporary relief. We need transformation, and that's why I think it's wonderful that the recovery package yesterday has a very clear objective to combine the stimulus and the recovery support with green credentials. It's not perfect. It could have been much more, but I think it's moving in the right direction. And I'm positively surprised, and that's part of my answer to the question about the Paris Agreement. I'm positively surprised that today we have a European Commission that speaks a totally different language than the Juncker Commission that we had the year before. Here is a group of people, I think, who really understand the challenge we are in, and that business as usual is no option. Incrementalism is no option. We need transformation. I'm not sure that we will make it. We need very good examples from different areas that we then can replicate. I think energy systems is crucial, and there at least things are happening. Learning curves are terrific when it comes to solar and wind. We need now things in the transport sector. We need now things related to materials and industrial production. And we need a lot of innovation when it comes to land use, both forests and agriculture. But I think most of the solutions are here or around the corner. So again, it's a question of political will. Maybe the biggest problem is that the world community is so split now. I mean, 2015 in Paris, they were working together. Can you imagine Trump, President Xi, Putin, Erdogan, and whoever what their names are, sitting together and crafting a policy? I cannot. We have to get rid of Trump, and we have to start working on the rest of the world to join hands. I don't think you can join hands with Trump, because he is such an impossible creature, and he thinks only about himself, not about anything else. But if the US gets a new president, I think we can start playing ball again. But if Europe can set a good example in some of these areas, I think we can scale up and scale out. Now I was very political, I'm sorry.
No, please, I think it's a very valid point. I mean, Trump is an enigma, and we don't seem to be able to align policies where a global response is needed. And I think that is why it's important to raise it in some sense, is that we need a cooperative response to COVID-19. We need a cooperative response to climate change. And that's what's brought us together here. But Ria, I want to address you with a question. I think it's a nicely phrased question, but could you expand on preparedness and solidarity and how you could combine the two?
Thank you, Theo, for that question. And it's quite insightful. I was trying to chew on that as well whilst I was listening to the other speakers. And I think intrinsically, preparedness doesn't exist without that conception of solidarity. The challenge is that in this world that we live in, we're moving from a multilateral sort of an approach to a more unilateral or a more protectionist regime. And today I had the pleasure of listening to Carmen Reinhardt, who is the incoming vice president for the World Bank. And she was talking about exactly this challenge, the rise of this protectionism. And I think this is where we do need to hold dear to those values that brought together that multilateral way of thinking, not just in that narrow neo-capitalist kind of approach, but in a sense of how can we learn from how different countries have progressed in their paths, and also give an equal space for countries that are emerging to do so in a way that is ecologically responsible. And I think that's the million-dollar question, which is also plaguing the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And that's also plaguing a lot of the dissonances that exist in the international trade regime. and the regime on climate governance as well as disaster risk management. But that being said, I think if we look at solidarity in the COVID sense, what I see that is as translating into is not just financial solidarity, but also solidarity in terms of know-how, sharing of technologies, different innovations across borders, and helping different countries to be able to find those solutions, which maybe countries that have been over the curve can share. So I think that that is definitely taking place. And I think that there are some examples of that transfer, not just in the North-South sense, but also in a South-South sense as well. And I feel that that solidarity will determine how we move forward, because the climate crisis, like COVID, is threatening humanity at large. So it is not localized. Climate like COVID does not discriminate. And I think we need to really reprioritize this protectionist, unilateral sort of way of thinking, and understand that this global mammoth scale of disaster and sort of impending crises and ongoing crises necessitate a consolidated, coordinated, and unified global response, because certain countries are able to provide more, let's say, expertise or technical know-how. Certain countries have more capacity to undertake R&D. So if we look at those complementary skill sets and overlay them one on top of the other, there's no way that we can't come up with some type of solution that can combat these global challenges. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ria. We've come to this difficult part in the event where we've got about 7 minutes left. We may run into 10 minutes left, but we've run to time, but fantastic questions are being asked. And thank you very much to everybody in the audience for coming forward with such provocative or thought-provoking questions, which are allowing us to really open up this dialogue. Martha, I want to bring it to you to make your concluding point, but I also want to invite you to maybe quickly ask one of these questions if I could. I apologize for making you rush, but it'd be fantastic if you could address it as well. But we've got a question from Alicia Ramos, and she said, I work in the built environment where the circular economy is often discounted by developers, owing to higher costs. How can they be encouraged to incorporate these principles? To you, Martha, if you...
Sorry, yeah. It's a really specific question. It comes back a bit to what I was talking about in the kind of what are the opportunities that come in the housing and built environment space. And actually a lot of the work that I end up doing at local government level about, how can local governments move away from this market fixing towards market shaping, has a huge amount of engagement with local housing and local building and things like the circular economy opportunities there. So I kind of face quite a lot of these questions quite a lot. And I think that one of the kind of key things to have people bear in mind is a little bit more kind of playing back a bit to what Ria said, but in a local microcosm, a bit more cross-sectoral and integrated work with different sectors within and beyond just the built environment. So a lot of the work that we do is around thinking about if joint groups together take on a mission. We talk a lot about mission-oriented innovation. If joint groups take on a kind of high-profile, high-ambition mission and draw in different sectors of the economy to work together on that mission, that's far more powerful and far more successful than kind of this previously siloed approach that's often been taken up by policies like industrial policy. So calling for a kind of overhaul, a new industrial approach that is more cross-sectoral, that brings in more actors. And I mean, this is what the circular economy is all about. But make sure that those kind of tenets are actually at the heart of what's going on. Is kind of the place that I would suggest to start. And I also think that, and this wasn't really in the question, but I think we've not talked extensively about the role of citizens within this, but I think it's important to bring them in. And when you do start talking about these long, these big high profile missions and economic directing that we kind of want to do in a green direction, in a post-COVID, in a healthy, green living direction, citizens need to be the kind of first port of call on this. And I'd say this is really my final statement, which is we've talked, everyone's saying we can't go back to business as usual, and I would argue, based on what I was saying earlier, you can't go back to government as usual either. It needs to take on a new way of being, and we also can't and shouldn't go back to citizens as usual. Citizens are now involved every day in a very politicized public health issue just in how they're living their lives. you're already involved. The question of how should systems become involved becomes redundant. And there's, as I said before, this genuine innovation going on in everyday life right now, just in how people have adapted to their new ways of living. So my kind of final thought is, one of the amazing things we have right now within groups like Cov360, within other groups, is that power to engage and to bring together different voices, different sectors, different within government, different ministries, within universities, different disciplines, and taking this approach of finding out questions, asking more, is a really vital precursor to organising and to advocating for the just recovery and for a long-term kind of green prosperity that leads us out of the COVID crisis. So that's kind of where my brain is thinking right now. How can we engage more citizens in this work?
I'm so pleased you said that, Martha. I think it's a fantastic point. It resonates so much with Cov360's work, where we are trying to promote agency on a local basis, speaking to global policies. And I think this is a critical juncture where we're at. We've got this odd paradoxical situation where with COVID-19, it does not work unless we have individual actions at all. It won't be picked up on, and that really resonates with our climate crisis as well, and to a lot of the brilliant points that have been made today. But Anders, can I draw this conversation to you to ask whether you could provide your concluding thoughts for us on this event and what we've shared today?
Oh, wow. First of all, I think if the circular economy was the easy thing to do, it would have happened. But the policy framework of the economy is simply flawed. And as long as it's cheaper to source materials that we've always done through these linear production flows, it's going to continue for most of the companies. That is a fact. So, and I think in almost every area, the incentive structure of the economy is not the right one. So there we have to do a lot of rethinking. And by the way, that's part of what the European Commission is trying to do now. Secondly, the purpose of companies. I go back to Milton Friedman in the 1960s and 70s, whose main point was that companies are here to make profits, full stop. That's the only purpose of a company. And I contrast that with Paul Polman, who says a company has to have a wider purpose. There are shareholders, yes, but there are also stakeholders, and there is society. And that debate is about ethics, it's about priorities, and it's about values. And I think it's very, very, very important. So we need to bring in the ethical dimension. The third point I would like to say is that I believe very strongly in new technologies. But having been in politics myself for quite a number of years, I know that most politicians don't know a shit, or very little at least, about exponential technologies. I'm chairing the committee distributing climate research funding in Sweden. And we are now trying some kind of matchmaking where we bring together people who work on algorithms and AI with climate scientists. They don't know each other. They've never talked. And those working on algorithms, they care very little spontaneously about the climate and vice versa. So there is no automatic fix here. We need to guide these technologies if we want them to help us reach the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And I think this is extremely important. And those of us who understand a little bit about the technologies, we have to help politicians realize that we need clever frameworks so that technology can help society in the right direction. And I think that's very, 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 very important. Finally, let me end by quoting Gregory Bateson. He said, one of his quotes, one of the major problems in society is the difference between how people think and how nature works. And that leads me to education. We don't help people today to understand how things are interrelated. Everything is connected to everything. We have thousands of disciplines and sub-disciplines in universities. How many programs do we have that talk about the whole and try to bring a systems view? How are economists trained? They learn nothing about nature. they learn a lot about production, consumption, finance, but nothing about nature. So here are a few points where I think we need to help each other and start moving in a different direction.
Thank you so much, Anders. It's been a pleasure today as well for those inputs. I think creating shared value, but also in terms of how the private sector works, but also I'm trying to think now is how does we create a shared biodiversity value in what we do and what we create. And this is part of that, I would assume. Ria, can I ask you, invite you, maybe you want to respond, but for your concluding remark, please.
Well, I think that it's summed up pretty well by Anders and Martha and the discussions that we've been having. But I believe that this COVID crisis is giving us a chance to reimagine another world. And I think this quick transition to a totally different way of life can give us an incentive to know that it's possible. Because I think prior to this, that other imagination really didn't exist. And I think that businesses are also waking up to the fact that the climate crisis is knocking on our doors, as is the public sector and as are people. So I feel like the time is very right to have that sea change and hopefully to turn a bit the tide. So I'm really pegging my hopes on this, and I hope that those listening will be able to reflect on this and see how they can impact this sort of a discourse and carry this discourse forward and translate it to action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ria, and thank you for bringing in the activism of people into this conversation, because I think it's crucial for what Cov360 do. It's volunteers who run it, and immensely in gratitude to all of us collaborating together. There's over 50 people around the globe, and it wouldn't be possible to have such a collective movement without that much of willingness to be involved, to want to do something, to want to act. The proactive response does exist, and thank you, Anders. It's been an absolute pleasure. It's been very profound to hear you speak. I deeply enjoy your writing, so thank you very much for attending this evening's event. And
thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Martha, for coming forward and delineating a little bit about what innovation is and what that social and public purpose is in terms of how we deal with this crisis. So thank you very much. And also, and finally, thank you, Ria, for coming forward and making us understand a little bit more about disaster risk preparedness. And if I too may just finish on a quote, and I find it an interesting quote for today's event because we've spoken a lot about technology and how we use it in our environment. It's from the philosopher Walter Benjamin, and it is, "Control of nature, the imperialists teach us, is the purpose of all technology. Yet for him, education is essential for the bridge between generations." He goes on, "It is not about controlling nature, but controlling the relationship between nature and humanity." Thank you very much for all of your time this evening, and thank you for joining us for this live event. It's been an absolute pleasure and a brilliant panel and discussion. Good night.